He will not surely
Well, thank you very much for inviting me on this extremely interesting and intriguing occasion. I wasn't quite sure what was meant by social protection, and so I decided to interpret it, as Lloyd George himself did, to mean certainly social welfare as it's conventionally conceived, but also protection in a rather wider sense, which he saw as including development policies that would, as he believed, increase employment and opportunity for working people to engage in small businesses and so on. But I'll come back to that in a moment. I think I rather disagree with some of my colleagues about the degree of Lloyd George's radicalism, certainly when it comes to thinking about social welfare issues. I think the People's Budget, as it's called, still has quite a resonance in the mythology of radical politics, perhaps more so nowadays in the Labour Party than in the Liberal Party. But I think, in a sense, it was part of Lloyd George's political radicalism that he managed to convey the impression that he was being very much more avant-garde about certain kinds of social policies than he really was. And I take Lord Morgan's point about he didn't get on very well with many of the Treasury officials, but I do think there was one Treasury position which had evolved since the 1890s, which he did share, and that was that the local taxation problem was fundamentally insoluble, and that by far the best way of dealing with it was simply for the Treasury to give more generous subventions to local authorities. And that, I think, is certainly one of the themes which Lloyd George always sort of tacitly falls back on. Another way in which I think he was rather less radical than is often believed is I think there is certainly evidence to suggest that he thought Asquith's Old Age Pensions Act had been a mistake, even though it was he, Lloyd George, who had steered it through Parliament. And of course, the old people of England are supposed to have prayed for the salvation of that good Lord George who had given them these wonderful pensions. But I think there is certainly some evidence to suggest that Lloyd George regretted that the pensions had been brought in as they had, that they hadn't been introduced simply as a kind of a poor law reform measure, or, much better, that they hadn't been left until plans for contributory national insurance were far more advanced. I think it's very significant that almost as soon as old age pensions were paid, there was a demand in the House of Commons that the disqualification of people who had received poor relief in the previous 10 years or who were currently living in workhouses, that this should be removed. In fact, this was something that was supported by unionists and by Labour as much as by the Liberals. And it was, in fact, passed through the House of Commons in 1911 and introduced in 1912. And Lloyd George's comments on this, I think, do reveal his extreme caution about being overgenerous with social welfare funding. He privately made it clear that any further extension of old age pensions was certainly not under his regime ever to fall upon the national exchequer. It was either to come about through relaxation of poor law rules, which he thought could be done by certain kinds of local reform, or much better it was to come about through an extension of national insurance. So I think there's a great deal of caution in Lloyd George's social policies, even though, of course, he made a great deal of them as a radical issue. But when you look at them in detail, you find that the figures involved are very small. He greatly admired the Bismarckian system, and in one of his supplementary budget speeches, he, of course, describes the Bismarckian insurance system to the House of Commons. And one of the points he makes is that this is a system which is paying out £40 million a year to German sick and elderly workers, of which only 3 million is coming from public funding. And it's shortly going to be increased to 56 million, with only 5 million coming out of public funding. So, again, I think there is an extreme element of caution and of hoping to find ways of improving social reform administration without it actually falling on the national exchequer. Now, Lloyd George, of course, didn't really... the social reform proposals of the New Liberals are not included specifically in the budget. And in order to look more carefully at how he linked the budget to the social reform programme of the Liberals, we have to look, I think, partly at his parliamentary speeches, but also the two books that came out under his authorship in 1909 and 1911, one of them entitled The People's Budget, and the other The People's Insurance. And again, I think this very strong thread of caution about public expenditure underlies the rhetoric. On the one hand, in The People's Budget, he says this is a war budget. It's a war on poverty and squalor and misery. And yet, on the other hand, he says, but never at any time will I have it be thought that I put relief in social services before the nation's defence. And he makes it quite clear, I think, in the book on the People's Budget, that the number one item of national public expenditure is the 4, and of course soon to be 8 dreadnoughts. He quite clearly, even in 1909, anticipates that there will be an 8 dreadnought programme. There are other ways, too, in which I think Lloyd George's social radicalism is open to question. And one of these is the much debated question of the poor law and stigma and treatment of the undeserving. Now, there are many books on the poor law which will tell you that it was very harsh and judgmental on the undeserving poor. In fact, it was technically illegal for the poor law ever to refuse relief on grounds of moral character. And in fact, there are cases of late Victorian relieving officers actually being given jail sentences for doing precisely this thing. So, and it's one of the great complaints of many of the respectable poor of this period, that there was no discrimination against the undeserving poor. Lloyd George thought that there should be, and that the best way ahead for many aspects of social welfare reform that couldn't be brought under social insurance was for the poor law to be liberalised in its treatment of the main body of clients, but for extremely harsh penal, sometimes imprisonment sentences to be imposed upon those who were, as he put it, feckless and undeserving. So again, I think there is an element of extreme caution about Lloyd George's radicalism. Now, what does Lloyd George actually finance? Obviously, there is a close link between the raising of new forms of taxation, and the fact that three major pieces of social welfare legislation are closely linked to this budget. The old age pensions provision, the unemployment insurance provisions, and the introduction of national health insurance, which of course included a tiny grain of provision of institutional care, which eventually develops into national health hospitals and hospital provision. What does Lloyd George provide for these? Well, I think it's very interesting to compare expenditure under the services introduced under the Lloyd George budget between 1909 and 1911, slightly revised again in 1912. If we compare expenditure under that legislation with expenditure under poor law services over the next 2 or 3 decades. And one thing that I think is very striking is that, contrary to what is often believed about the new liberal social welfare programme, poor law expenditure, often much more liberal by the 1920s and 30s than it had been in the Edwardian period. But nevertheless, expenditure under the various poor law services continues to exceed that of the new liberal services until 1948, when the poor law, of course, was finally abolished. There was no period in that intervening time at which the poor law didn't, and its successor institutions, because of course it's renamed public assistance and then national assistance, but there was no period in which expenditure under those poor law services didn't in fact exceed those under the services that were directly produced as a result of the Lloyd George budget. So I think I would like to put in a word for suggesting that despite the fact that Lloyd George is a great political radical, in some ways he was an extremely cautious and orthodox Chancellor of the Exchequer. Thank you.